Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this snowy Tuesday morning right after Thanksgiving. So as everyone's getting settled in, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started with the webinar. I am Joseph Scott. I'm the director of the Procurement Technical Assistance Center at Youngstown State University. My colleague Jane Stewart is also here with us. We're putting on this event today. Jane is the Associate Director for OU PTAC, and she's based out of Lakeland Community College in the Northeast here. And so PTAC's, just a brief overview of PTAC for those of you who may be unfamiliar with PTAC. Procurement Technical Assistance Center, we exist to help businesses sell to the government. So whether that's starting out to developing a capability statement, to preparing for a matchmaker, helping you find contract opportunities, network opportunities, and then on the post-award side of things, or just other general contracting knowledge and information. So CMMC fits right into our purview in helping you understand everything about the upcoming cybersecurity changes and the kind of roadblock, or not roadblock, but requirement that everyone will have to have in the future for doing business with the DoD if certain clauses exist. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Damon Hacker. We have here from Vestige Digital Investigations. They are a firm here in Northeast Ohio, and they have a couple other offices across the country. And they focus on cybersecurity. So Damon, take it away.
Great. Joey, thanks for the introduction. Great. As Joey said, my name is Damon Hacker. Couldn't have picked a better name for myself if I had tried, given what we do. Yes, we do cybersecurity. I've been involved in it. Been involved in the IT world actually since a very young age, but been in the industry for about 30 years or so. Definitely has been the last 20 years has been spent in the cybersecurity, what I'm going to call the regulatory world, and got a real good understanding of all of the different frameworks that are out there. But today, obviously, we're going to focus on CMMC. So I thought this is a really good quote just to kind of set the things off, set motion here. It's actually from the CMMC Accreditation Board, and we're going to see it again in a couple of minutes, as obviously this was a big impetus for it. But anyhow, moving on, the agenda for today is we're going to talk about what CMMC is. There's 221,000 suppliers to the DoD, and I would venture to say that the vast majority of them have not, even necessarily heard of it or know what's going on with it. So after today's session, you will have a very good understanding as to what it is, why it exists, and kind of the time frame as to why the change. As we go through this, we're going to also talk about the NIST 800-171, which many of you probably are familiar with. And we're trying to talk about how that kind of intersperses or interplays in between it. So what is CMMC? It stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. All right. So obviously, everything with CMMC is all going to have to do with cybersecurity and the controls that an organization needs to have in place, basically to address that first slide that I had there, which was that over the last several years, we've noticed it's been happening for quite some time, where intellectual property that the government has contracted organizations to provide, as well as other sensitive information, has ended up in the hands of our adversaries. So the biggest thing is really to provide the DoD with the assurance that those in the defense industrial base are doing the right things in terms of preventing that sensitive information from getting out into the wrong hands. It is a certification. We're going to talk much more about that and what that actually means. And then the two middle words, that maturity model, is something that I really kind of like, because what it kind of stands for is that it's not, that it fits every organization based upon the maturity level that's needed from there. So some organizations are going to have to comply to a much higher degree than others, and we'll definitely get into the details and the weeds on that one as we go through this from there. But who does it apply to? As I mentioned, there's about 221,000 DoD suppliers. So whether it's primes or subcontractors, it does apply to pretty much everyone. There are several different levels and some information that we're going to kind of talk about in terms of anybody who receives federal contract information, FCI, is at the very lowest level of the CMMC. You need to have at least something in place, and we'll talk about what the different maturity levels are. But suffice it to say that if you receive FCI, federal contract information, you are required to be compliant at least to the very lowest level, maturity level 1. If you also handle controlled unclassified information, or CUI, then you'll have to rise up to a higher level on the maturity level. To date, or at least everything that we've seen so far, there is only one exemption from having to comply. And that exemption is if you supply commercial off-the-shelf products, meaning that the same thing that you're providing to the DoD is what you provide to every other customer that comes to it. That you basically have a catalog or products that you can literally just pull off the shelf and send to them. At any point in time, if there's any kind of designation, a specification, or any kind of tweak that you do for the DoD, then it no longer applies. Then the COTS, the commercial off the shelf exemption, no longer applies. So it is a pretty small percentage of the companies where the COTS will where it'll apply to that from there. So let's start with some definitions. We'll start with that first one, which is FCI, Federal Contract Information. It is defined under DFARS, and basically it is information that is not coming from the government, but instead, either it's being provided to the government or generated for the government, generally under a contract to develop or deliver. It includes things basically like transactional information, the contract itself, the bid characteristics, specifications, that kind of stuff that is that falls under there. So basically, if you've got a contract and you've got enough information to build a government, you have federal contract information, and as a result of that, you're going to fall under CMMC, at least at its lowest level from there. The term FCI, kind of new. It was added to clear up basically this logic gap between the original kind of cybersecurity measures that some of the large primes like Lockheed and Raytheon and that kind of stuff were taking, to then what became NIST 800-171, and then on into CMMC. So it is this definitional thing to basically clear up that from there. And there is one interesting note on that is that that it may not be federal contract information until the actual contract itself has been awarded. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about that because you're going to learn what the certification requirements are in terms of bidding and some things there. And there's a couple little caveats in there, and this is going to come back out when we talk about that. Part of the whole issue, both with FCI and with CUI, and what the whole, what CMMC is really focused around, isn't so much about securing the actual information itself, but instead securing the systems where that information might be found. All right. So clearly, at the end of the day, what they're interested in is making sure that information doesn't get out the door. But when you really start thinking about it and understanding where information exists, how easy it is to copy, to move around. I mean, even in your own day-to-day work, you might put things up on a server, you might put things out in the cloud, you might have it on a local machine, and you might work with it, contemporaneously on, one or more of those sources. You still have to protect that information, but if we go a little step above that, and we're protecting those systems where that information is generally found, then, from the DoD standpoint, we have a much better chance of securing the information that's on there. And I'll step back even from the DoD role. Just in general, cybersecurity, that is a true statement. If we can shore up the controls that the systems have on it, then we don't have to worry so much about what actual information is on there. We may need to compartmentalize that, and there will be some discussion about that as we get into the discussion on CUI. But for the most part, what we're looking at in this is what can we do to secure the environment such that any of that information, whether it's FCI or whether it's CUI, is protected. So where could we locate some of that stuff? Well, here's some examples, right? I mean, you might receive FCI from an email system. Ideally not, unless it's an encrypted email system, but it happens. I know that I've got several clients that even receive CUI over general email. I think as a general comment, our society as a whole is pretty bad about cybersecurity and really has only turned its attention to it in about the last 6 to 8 years. I think government and the DoD and the suppliers and that kind of stuff have even been a little bit further behind on that, which is kind of interesting when you think about the fact that a lot of times you've got access to sensitive information that other people don't have. But anyhow, suffice it to say, email systems, messaging systems such as Teams or Slack, those kind of things. It could be hard storage of FCI. So whether that is paper-based, or if you receive it via like thumb drives or DVDs, things along that lines. Obviously, workstations, the networks, the servers, that kind of stuff is all areas where you might find federal contract information on that. Now, I'm going to kind of juxtapose that with CUI. CUI is also a relatively newer term. Over the last maybe 3-4 years or so, stands for Controlled Unclassified Information. One thing to note about the whole CMMC program is this does not apply to classified information, secret, top secret information. Those are taken care of with other certifications and other requirements and are held to an even higher degree than this. Controlled unclassified information is that step right below the classified information. Again, it's information that the government creates or possesses, or that an entity such as you guys create or possess for the benefit of the government from there. And I've got some examples of what that's going to look like here in a minute as well. The other thing to note about this is it's not about what you might be accessing on the government's sites. So if there's a portal or something that is available and you receive all of your information and all of that information stays up there, then it's not talking about that. We're talking about your systems itself that are not part of the government. So some categories of CUI. So this is, again, these are just broad categories of the kind of thing that that you might fall under. Certainly anything nuclear or intelligence related makes a lot of sense. A lot of companies fall under what we call the critical infrastructure, right? So power, utilities, water management, that kind of stuff would all fall under there. Immigration, you can see. I mean, it's pretty broad, across the planes there. Some things that fall under CUI would be, maybe maybe the government, or maybe you provide to the DoD analysis or some kind of studies. You receive or create data sets or analyze those data sets. Even the standards and specifications for a number of items will fall under that. I know I've got several clients that just barely scratch the surface of things for the DoD, but they do receive blueprints or drawings, maybe even drawings of an airplane or of a ship or something along that lines from there. Engineering drawings, the research done, all that kind of stuff will fall under there. Now, it is interesting to note that CUI is actually supposed to be marked, right? So it is supposed to have an official marking on there. Actually, the previous, this right down here in the lower right-hand corner is kind of the mark or the designation from a logo standpoint, and then also the double slash with controlled on there. So theoretically, you should know that you're receiving this CUI. I will say I've seen a number of situations where our clients have received it and they don't necessarily, it doesn't have a marking on it. What's interesting about that is that the way that it's kind of written is that is still your responsibility to control that, and in fact, actually to make sure that it is marked accordingly from there. So the difference between the two, FCI versus CUI, they are very similar, right? It's information created or collected by or for the government. And from there, CUI is what requires additional safeguarding. You can think of it this way, that CUI is a subset of federal contract information. By its very nature, all CUI is federal contract information, but it's not the other way around. You could have federal contract information without having CUI. And then, of course, you've got all the public information. And so what we're doing is we're taking that stuff that is normally, should be sensitive, controlled, whatever, and we're pulling it out, designated as FCI, and then a subset of that is the CUI from there. All right. So that's the information that we're talking about that we need to kind of worry about. CMMC itself is, like I said before, it's a cybersecurity standard. It measures the overall maturity from a security side of things, not from a financial standpoint, not from a quality or any of the other kinds of standards that are out there. It really does focus just on cybersecurity. And it is a replacement, kind of. It's a replacement for NIST 800-171, all right? Most of you, I would assume, are at least familiar with NIST 800-171. I will say, though, just like my opening statement about a lot of people not knowing about CMMC, I have been surprised by the number of organizations that are suppliers to the DoD, maybe just tangentially, but are suppliers that don't know about NIST 800-171. If you don't, you got just a little bit of a primer, but you'll see how it plays into, I'm not going to say it goes away, but this is kind of the evolution, maybe is even a better word for it than replacement for there. So NIST 800-171 was introduced in 2017 by the DoD. It comprises of 110 controls that are all cybersecurity related from there. One thing that was, kind of unique for most people, 800-171 was a self-certification. Most organizations fit under what was called the basic certification, meaning that you would go and do a self-assessment of those 110 controls, provide an answer back to whomever was requesting it. So a lot of times, a prime would reach out and say, hey, we want you to go ahead and, fill this out and give us your self-certification on it. There were actually 3 parts to comply with the NIST 800-171. One was, the final thing was an attestation that those 110 controls were in place. It also required the creation of what was called an SSP, or a system security plan, which was basically just taking each one of those 110 controls and documenting what it was that your organization did specifically to meet those. And actually, I call it controls, and it isn't. It's what they really are is 110 control objectives, meaning that these are 110 things that the DoD has said you need to have in place. We're not going to dictate or mandate how you do it. You need to come up with the controls that you're going to apply against those control objectives. So basically what you were doing is you were attesting to the fact that you had all 110 of those control objectives handled, generally by documenting it in your system security plan. And where you had gaps, because almost every organization probably had a handful of gaps, whether it was just one or two, or some had a lot of them, you needed to then document in what was referred to as a poem for the plan. It stood for a plan of action and milestones, which was, okay, it's a remediation plan. Here's what you're going to do to address that, and here's the time frame in which you're going to address that in. So those were the three. Those were the three starts from there. I'm sorry.
A couple questions for you. I feel like now is a good pause point.
Sure.
So the first one I want to ask you, this comes from Cynthia, and she mentions, it's a comment on, fairness. How fair is it to require, paid certification when other systems might not be, up to snuff? Would you like to comment on that necessarily?
Yeah. So obviously, part of the whole idea is this is getting pushed out across the board for everything, right? So theoretically, everybody in the defense industrial base needs to have this stuff in place. Having said that, and I think maybe Cynthia's question comes to the fact of the fact that there's some large companies. She even mentions Microsoft and Amazon. Says they're more risky. Yes, to some degree, I would agree that they have a high risk because obviously more people use them and they touch a lot more. The reality of it, though, is they also have a lot more resources at their disposal and have the right controls in place to really address the situation. Having said that, obviously, what we see and read and hear in the news is these large entities where we still, you pick up the paper every single day or open your email or something, and you read about another entity that's been compromised. The point on that is that there are, to a motivated attacker, there are always going to be ways of getting into the environment. But the more we can do to control that environment, the less likely that's to happen. All right. And the analogy I like to use on that is think about driving into your neighborhood tonight. And, as you get in the neighborhood, not one, not two, not five, but 50 burglars are going up and down the road. They're knocking on the door, ringing the doorbell, rattling the windows, checking the door to see if it's unlocked, looking for vulnerabilities to get in. Right. Eventually, they might. That exact thing is what happens on the internet 24/7, 365. It's happening all the time. People are rattling the windows just to see if they get in. Just like we do in our home, though, there are things that we can put in place that detract or make it more difficult for a burglar to the point where they just move on to the next one, right? We lock our doors. We make sure our windows are locked. Maybe as we leave, we turn lights on. Maybe we even have them set to, automatically come on at certain times, make it look like somebody's home. Maybe you have a dog that barks when, somebody comes to the door. Maybe you have an alarm system. Maybe you live in a gated community. Maybe you even have your own security detail if you're really, really paranoid. Again, each one of those controls that we put in place makes it a little bit more unattractive for that that burglar to move on to the next victim. Having said that, though, if there's a motivated person, they are going to be able to get into the environment regardless of what you've done. Right. So NIST 800-171 CMMC is all about what are those controls that we can put in place to make it less attractive, to protect the things so that it's less likely that something's going to happen. Does the DoD recognize, or does the DoD require zero compromises? The answer is no. Nobody can. Microsoft can't guarantee that nobody is going to be able to, to get into their systems and that kind of stuff. But they can put a lot of these controls in place. They can do the monitoring, all that kind of stuff. You will notice as we go through some of this stuff, some of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of controls are preventative. Some of the controls are detective, meaning that we get notified when something happens, a la the alarm system in your home, right? You get notified, if somebody breaks in. Some of the controls are all around what happens when, right? What happens when somebody gets in? What do you do from an investigative side of things? What do you do from a notification side of things to basically stop the damage, or at least get our arms around what the damage is, from there. Like I said, it's not a for sure thing, but the more companies that put these kind of controls in place, the less likely we're going to have these problems. And that's basically what this is all in regards to. I know you also had mentioned, and also another fact and figure that a lot of people don't recognize. We hear about and read about the big ones, right? Because that sells news, it sells advertising. Those are the things that get people. The reality of it, if you look statistically, and if you want to, there's a couple of resources. Every year, Verizon puts out what they call their Data Breach Incident Response Plan, the DBIR. Comes out in early spring. There's another one called the Ponemon Institute that does a look. And year after year, one of the things that continues to be identified in that is that while there are some really big breaches that are happening, somewhere around 70 to 80% of the breaches actually happen at the small and mid-sized business, the 3 billion and less, business. And a lot of that happens because of the fact that organizations of that size don't have the deep pockets, the resources, the the experience, the expertise, and that kind of stuff of things like Microsoft and Amazon and some of the bigger companies. So although we read about those, the reality of it is the actual problem is at the smaller and mid-sized business from there.
That makes sense. So one other question I want to ask you, which I think will help set the tone for the rest of the presentation too. Just a little clarification on who CMMC will affect, and this comes from Patrick. He mentions that he does a lot with video production. He's hired by DAS, which I'm assuming is the Department of Admin Services,
Yep.
which I know is a state agency. I don't know if there's a federal one. They do a lot of commercial production, TV, digital platform videos like that. Will they have to have a CMMC certification requirement?
Yeah. So again, the real kicker is if you receive federal contract information, you are at least going to be at level 1, right? If you receive controlled unclassified information, which I could see might be the case in Patrick's request there, because if they're creating training and safety guides and that kind of stuff specifically for things having to do with the DoD, then chances are they are receiving information that would be covered under it from there. I wouldn't know without really taking a look at the kinds of stuff and the specifications and the things that they received. But I would say at a very minimum, because of the work that they're doing with DAS and that kind of stuff, they probably apply at the lowest level at FCI. And if they're receiving that CUI, they're going to be at least in the middle at a level 3. We'll talk more about that, from there. So.
But right now, CMMC is just DoD. Correct? Does not apply to state agencies or other agencies at the moment.
That's correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So continuing back on the NIST 800-171. So we talked about those were it's a self-certification. You need those 3 parts to comply. Why replace it? Well, the biggest thing is it goes back to some of the things I've alluded to here already is the fact that so many organizations weren't doing it. Right. What's basically happened is the DoD has had a number of situations where they've had to go in and investigate breaches, compromises of one of the organizations. And they found that even though the company had self-certified, they were finding that a lot of the controls weren't in place. Now, sometimes, very small percentage of that may have been malicious, right? I mean, that the person just said, hey, I'm going to say we're compliant and we're not. That probably happened in a very, very, very small percentage of the companies. More likely what occurred was a misunderstanding as to what the control objectives really meant and what controls they need to have in place. And that's something that I see not just in the DoD, I see that across the spectrum in all of the cybersecurity frameworks. Let's face it, I mean, if cybersecurity was easy, we'd all be doing it. The good news is that actually with some knowledge, with some experience, with some guidance and that kind of stuff, it actually is and can be relatively easy. And again, it's kind of like I said, in terms of putting those controls in place like at home, right? If we can layer those things from there. The joke I like to use on that one too is cybersecurity is a little like the two kids that are playing in the forest and they run across a bear. And the one reaches down and starts tying his shoes, and the other one looks at him and says, what, you gonna outrun the bear? He says, no, I just have to outrun you, right? Well, in some sense, that's kind of the same thing. If we can make our environment that much better, chances are the bad guy is just gonna move on to something other. Now, having said that, for DoD work, there is an incentive for our adversaries to get in there from there. So there are some industries where we do see an increased level of attack, aggressiveness, and level of sophistication of the attackers precisely because of the information that's there. Think about like from a financial services standpoint, retail, that's where the money is, right? With the DoD stuff, it tends to be intellectual property and national security type of stuff that people are after. So there is a heightened risk just from anybody in the defense industrial base from there. So again, like a lot of said, a lot of them was just a failure to engage in that. Some of the other criticisms that came about with NIST 800-171 was the fact that it was kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. You had 110 control objectives. Everybody was expected to have the same ones in place. From the DoD side of things, the criticism was that it was a self-certification, meaning that people would say that they're certified, and maybe they were, maybe they weren't from there. The other thing about it was, if you think about it, there was it was the stick approach versus a carrot approach. There was little incentive to have it done other than if you didn't have it put in place and there was a compromise and the DoD found out about it because you had duty to notify them, and they come in at that point in time, they could pull the contract, they could sue for breach of contract, they could put fines, penalties, that kind of stuff. But the reality of it is the damage is already done at that point in time. All those good intentions with all those controls, if they weren't in place, the sensitive information, the intellectual property, whatever, already went out the door. So that's another reason why they were looking to make some changes to that. About 164,000 out of those 220,000 firms that are unique DoD providers are small businesses, right? And when you look at the problems that most small businesses have, and kind of alluded to earlier in my conversation about the fact that 70 to 80% of the problems that we don't read about from a cybersecurity are actually happening at that small business side, it's because they don't have the right controls in place. Realistically, they don't have the resources to be able to do it, right? How many of you have a dedicated, I'll start with, how many of you have a dedicated IT department? A lot of times people are using an outside IT resource. If you do have an IT department, do you have somebody who's dedicated to cyber? Probably not. And if you do have somebody who's dedicated to cyber, do you have multiple things, and are you doing monitoring and protection? And I mean, it goes on in terms of all the resources that realistically you might need if you're trying to do this, from the ground up. Technology in general, and I will definitely say with cyber, it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. And the other part to it is that from an IT side of things, it's somebody who's in IT, general IT, and somebody who's in cybersecurity, it tends to be the opposite side of the same coin, all right? We look at things a little bit differently. And in fact, if you think about why organizations put IT in place, it makes sense. Most people put IT, information technology, in place to make things easier, faster, more efficient, more convenient, right? I mean, think about everything that we've done with COVID, right? I mean, work from home. We want it to be as convenient as possible. We want to have remote access. We want to be able to do everything. We want to be able to do everything from our tablets, from our phones, all that kind of stuff. It is, in most organizations, IT's job to make data and the systems as accessible as possible. Cybersecurity is the exact opposite. We want to lock things down and make it as inaccessible and as inconvenient as possible. Now, truthfully, there's a delicate balance between there. We've got to find that delicate balance because I can make a really, really secure system. It'll be a single computer without a monitor, without a keyboard, without a mouse, no internet connection, buried in a vault somewhere in a mountain with no doors in and out, right? Really, really secure, just not really convenient, right? And then there's the flip side to that, which is we open the whole system up, everybody has access to it, and we're not using passwords because they're too inconvenient, blah, 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 and you get the picture, right? We need a delicate balance between that from there. So anyhow, those are some of the, the documented problems with NIST 800-171. So let's get back into CMMC and understand what it is and how it addresses some of those shortcomings of NIST 800-171. The first big one is that it does get rid of the whole one size fits all. There are now 5 maturity levels, levels 1 through 5, with 1 being the lowest. Level 1 is basically the safeguarding of federal contract information. Again, this is the one where of those 221,000 entities, anybody who's not exempted because of COTS, the off-the-shelf solutions, then you're going to at least fall at level 1 with basic safeguarding of federal contract information. I think you will find very few who fall in level 2 because level 2 is kind of a stepping stone to get to level 3. Level 3 is the minimum, it's the floor that if you receive controlled unclassified information, you will have to be at least at a level 3. Level 4s and 5s then take that the next level up. It is all about reducing the risks of what we call an APT, or an advanced persistent threat. APTs are the ones that we read about in the newspapers. It's the Anthems, the Home Depots, the OPMCs, the whatever the flavor of the breaches this week, in terms of the ones where somebody's gotten in, they've been in there for quite some time, it's discovered there's a loss of financial information, PII, HIPAA information, all that kind of stuff. For those organizations where it's a higher risk because of what they provide to the government or whatever, they will have to qualify at a level 4 and a level 5 from there. The actual CMMC itself builds upon itself at each level. At level 1, there are 17 practices that need to be put in place, all right? At level 2 introduces 55 additional practices that need to be provided. And it also introduces 2 processes that have to be completed for each of the different domains. And we'll talk about the domains here in a little bit. But you can see, going from level 1 for a total of 17 control objectives, going up to level 2, you have to have all 17 of the level 1s in place. And then you have to have the 55 practices and the 2 processes in place to get you at 74 different controls that you'll have to have in place at level 2. That number jumps up to 133 at level 3. I would assume, just based upon companies that we've already consulted with, doing things that, the vast majority of those on this call are going to be at a level 1 or at a level 3. I doubt very much we're going to have too many people that are at a level 4 and a level 5. And as I said, level 2 is really kind of a stepping stone that gets you there. So if all you handle is FCI, federal contract information, you're automatically at a level 1. It's probably where you're going to stay. You got 17 things to be put in place. Guess what? Those 17 things are relatively easy to put in place. They're commonsensical, and they're the kinds of things that not only are they good for the DoD, they're actually good for your business, right? I mean, they're organizational. I mean, for your organization, they're things that ought to be in place anyhow, just from the standpoint of making sure that you're secure to that degree. Level 3, you got 133 things you're going to have there. This kind of just shows you how it builds upon each other. You can see the 17 practices are always there. You're adding 55 practices to level 2, or adding the 58 practices at level 3, et cetera, to kind of build up from there. Now here's the kicker. All 110 control objectives of NIST 800-171 are still part of CMMC, and they show their head in level 3. At level 3, those 133 controls that need to be in there, 110 of them are the same NIST 800-171 controls that you as an organization that supplies the DoD should have had in place starting in 2017. There are 23 CMMC specific items that have been added on because of things that the DoD has recognized over time and said, hey, the NIST 800-171 controls, although they're great, there's some gaps. And the 23 that they've added get you to the 133. Now that is also to say, because if you look at it, it's not like we're introducing 110 controls in level 3. We're only adding 58 practices and 1 process. That also means that in level 2 and level 1, some of these control objectives that are here are the NIST 800-171 controls from there. So by the time you get to a level 3, all 110 800-171 control objectives are in there. I mentioned earlier there were different domains. There's actually 17 domains. So there's no coincidence there that there's 17 control objectives at level 1. Basically, there's things that address each one of these domains. We're going to take some time later in the presentation to go through like some general things about what's in each of these domains. But for right now, just the fact that there's 17 of these capability domains. We have these practices and processes, right? So there's different maturity levels for each of those, or different kind of labels, I guess I would say. So you've got practices, things that you do on a regular basis. And then starting at level 2, we've got processes that get put in place as well. And the idea, again, is at level 1, your practices, you're basically performing things. You've got the basic cyber hygiene in place from a practice side of things. As we move up to level 2 and to level 3, we'll focus on level 3, we're starting to now get into a place where the processes are actually managed, right? So somebody's in charge of them, it's documented, there's a policy that's there as well. So it's a managed process. And not just have basic or intermediate cyber hygiene, but you've got good cyber hygiene. Again, putting the controls around your house, right? We're locking our doors, we're locking our windows, we've got the lights on, we've got an alarm system, we've got a neighborhood watch program, that kind of stuff. We're now at that level of good cyber hygiene. Does it mean that somebody can't get in there? No, it doesn't. Even if we got up to level 4 and a level 5, that optimizing and advanced progressive on that, does it mean that somebody can't get in there? No, it doesn't. But the likelihood of it drops significantly because we've got the right things in place from there. All right. So that's the first part. The first change with CMMC is the levels, the maturity. We get rid of the fact that it's a one size fits all. For a lot of organizations that only have to qualify for level 1, it's 17 controls that you've got to have in place. The other thing, and this is a big change, it is no longer a self-certification. In order to become CMMC certified or CMM certified, you have to have a third-party auditing organization called a C3PAO come in and assess to the level that you're trying to qualify for. All right, so that's a huge difference. And that is inclusive all the way down to level 1. Level 1 through level 5, you have to have a C3PAO hired to do it. The CMMC accreditation board is, and I've got a slide later on with some resources and that kind of stuff, is where you actually go to find that C3PAO. We'll talk more about that as the presentation goes on as well. Another huge change is now we're talking about a carrot approach instead of the stick approach. Certification is actually required to bid on projects, not necessarily, we'll talk about the caveat there, why it's starred, but think of it from this standpoint is that instead of it being like the NIST 800-171, you're self-assessing, and if something happens and the DoD comes in and looks at it and says, oh, you weren't compliant, now you face penalties, fines, loss of contract, lawsuits, that kind of stuff. This is the opposite way, which is now you're going to be required to have it to bid on projects. Now, technically speaking, they can't prohibit you from bidding on this, right? So I've starred this, but I want you to think about it from the standpoint of you got to bid on it. You can actually bid on it. You can even win the bid and actually even manufacture or produce there. You just can't invoice for it, right? So I don't know about you, but I think a lot of organizations look at that and go, okay, for all intents and purposes, unless we're there, we're not going to be bidding on, we're not going to be, manufacturing and doing things without having the CMMC in place, from there. What you should expect is starting in 2021, and there is a ramp up period we'll talk about, but starting in 2021, what is now going to happen is when RFIs and RFPs go out, you're going to see that they will have a maturity level designation on it. Not all contracts in 2021 will have that, but starting in 2021, you'll start seeing them. And basically, you, in order to win that, to bid on that, you'll need to be certified with a C3PAO and have your certification from the accreditation board at that level or higher. Meaning that if you are bidding on a level 3 RFI or RFP, you will need to have at least a level 3 CMMC. You could also have a level 4 or a level 5, but you can't have a 1 or a 2 from there. All right. Okay. So one of the questions, Cynthia's asking a lot of questions. This is good. I like it, Cynthia. Ask the question about if our people encounter data as part of their job on their government computers and equipments, do they fall under it? The actual answer on that is probably not, no. Again, if I'm reading your question right, that it is the government-owned system, you won't fall under CMMC for that because it's only for the contractors for non-federal systems where this fits. So what if our people are more like staff augmentation? Yeah, again, on that one, I would say you probably don't. However, here's the caveat with that. Is you're going to have to look at the RFI or RFP, right? Because if it's requesting it, if it's saying in order to bid on this, you need to be at a level, 1 or level 3 or whatever, then you're going to need to be there. So, so another framework, STARS 3, because we looked at these for STARS and almost none apply. We do not have servers and do not supply equipment. Our employees generally have you have them use their customer equipment and VPNs. Well, okay, so on that one, so kind of following along the same one, this is also from Cynthia. The answer to that, I guess, is, again, if it's the government system, then I would say no. However, if it's that you're using the servers and customer equipment of another DoD provider, in essence, you're a subcontractor to a prime or a subcontractor, then yeah, you probably would need to be on it because they're going to need to be on that as well from there. So Is it all bids? Michael asked, is it all bids? Again, starting in 2021, we'll expect to see them on there. There is going to be a ramp up time frame. It's actually set through 2025 for that to happen. There are some, I've seen some discussions around some direct purchase and that kind of stuff where it may not require it. But again, when we get to the interim rule, which I'm going to bring up in a few minutes, you're going to see how they close that gap from there. Liza asked a question about how long does it take to get level 1 certified. I will say in general, the CMMC AB, the accreditation board, is suggesting for any certification, you should allot about 6 months. Now, is it going to take you that long to actually do that? No, but that's the process in terms of getting the control, understanding what the controls are, getting the controls in place, and having a C3PAO come in and do that. One of the things that you should also know and recognize is, and we're going to talk much more about this when we talk about like how to actually get this thing done, is evidence, right? Is actually having the control objective in place that meets the control objective and be able to produce evidence that you're actually doing that. And as a result of that, there may be some time that you need to let a control run so that you can actually show that yes, in fact, it's in place and working from there. Are subs required to maintain the same level CMMC level certification as the prime? Not for necessarily as the prime, but for that particular contract, yes. So if a prime, it might be, if you're talking about Raytheon or something, they may have to be at a level 5, but the contract that you're working on is a level 3. They would have to be at a minimum at a level 3, but so would you, from there on that one. I've got one bit of good news, partially good news here for you. And that is the fact that the DoD has acknowledged that compliance with CMC is an allowable expense under the contract. Now, there's some caveats with that though. The first and foremost is NIST 800-171, right, is 110 out of 133 controls at level 3. That's been in place since 2017. The DoD's attitude towards this is, you should have already had that in place. What they're looking at is saying, remember those 23 controls where it's additional information that's CMMC, then yeah, that, you probably could, that can be an allowable expense under the contract from there. Each contract will dictate in some fashion how much is allowable under that. From there, like I said, it's likely going to be for the CMMC components, not the the core 800-171 components under that. I will also say some of the chatter that we've heard and talked about and that kind of stuff amongst other providers, as well as some of the consultants and companies like ourselves and C3PAOs and that kind of stuff has been, while it might be allowable, recognize that if it adds to the expense of the contract, it may end up getting, putting you to a place where you're not competitive on that, and you'll end up losing the contract from there. Yeah, so Cynthia and Catherine, you picked up on the fact that, yeah, you must have it before you bid, so the ones who get the contract get it paid, and if losing bidders not, or how can you get it, how can you bill for the CMMC when you can't win a contract until you're certified? You are correct. But again, 800-171 was already in place. Theoretically, it's only the gap stuff that's in there on that one. So yeah, Catherine, same thing. So all right, so let's talk about CMMC and the phase-in. It was announced in 2019, right? So it was actually supposed to go into effect as of June 30th of this year, 2020. In March, with COVID, they actually looked at it and said, okay, well, we're going to move it down the road by 3 months from there. And then by July, when we recognized how significant COVID really was and how far actually behind it pushed the accreditation board and whatnot, they punted it and said, all right, it's going to start in January of 2021. It is a phased-in approach. it affects, it requires all DoD suppliers to be in compliance by 2025, right? So there are some times, and there's some time there. I want to caution you though, that when some people see that 2025, they say, oh, I don't have to be compliant until 2025. Well, the reason that 2025 number or date is out there is, think about it. There are some contracts that have just been signed that are 3, 4, 5 year long contracts. They've just been signed right before CMMC takes in effect, and now they're not up for renewal until 2025. If that's your only contract, okay, well, maybe you don't need to get involved until then. But if you've got multiple contracts, chances are there's going to be one that hits before that from there. But by 2025, all DoD suppliers will need to be compliant from there. Here's one more thing you need to be aware of. So September 29th, the DoD came out with an interim rule, DFARS 2019 DO41. It was effective as of yesterday. And basically it introduced 3 new regulations to DFARS that kind of closes up some of the gap from there. All right. So the first one was that, a notice of the 800-171 assessment requirements, which we'll talk about. The first 2, the 7019 and 7020, address that. And then the third one really closed up some of the loopholes in the CMMC. Specifically, the idea that contractors and subcontractors need to have not only meet the CMMC level, but need to have it for the duration of the contract. If you looked at the original CMMC, the way that it was worded, it could be interpreted that you needed to have it in place, but then you didn't need to maintain it until you had to recertify. It basically was a stopgap measure, this interim rule was. All right. So it's the stopgap between 800-171 and CMMC. The other thing that it did, it said that as of yesterday, every organization that was under 800-171 was supposed to submit their results, their self-assessment for 800-171 up to the supplier performance review system, SPRS. And that assessment that you performed had to have been completed within the last 3 years, right? So, which makes sense, 2017 onward from there. If you fall under 800-171, which you would, because you're probably, you're here from there, there and interested. If you fall under that, if you have not done that, you need to look into that, because as of yesterday, those should have been submitted. The other thing that it does is it obligates the contracting officer on the government side to actually go out to SPRS and obtain that score, that self-assessment score, prior to awarding the bid. In essence, it's closing up this gap between now and 2025 when companies need to have CMMC in place. And what they're basically doing is kind of creating a credit score in SPRS for the contracting officers to go out to and look at and say, okay, yep, I've got 2 competing bids. They're very close in nature. They're very close to this there. One's got a score on their 800-171 of 104, and this one over here has a score of 70. Which one am I going to go with, right? So it's creating that kind of that incentive on that one. I'm going to jump back to this slide again. The other thing that it did is for medium and high risk contractors, they can no longer self-certify on the 800-171, that they have to actually have a government come in and do the assessment. Alternatively, have the CMMC put in place from there. So there's a link. If you haven't put it in, like I said so far, you can go out to this. There's more information about both the supplier performance risk system as well as actually getting it in the system. You actually do it through PIEE, which is procurement. It's a weird acronym. I forget what that one is, but you go into there and you create a specific role under that for SPRS, and then the cybersecurity role, and then you can go ahead and add there. It actually doesn't take very long. It probably takes 5 minutes if you've already got your PIEE account, all you do is you basically put in you look up your cage code, you add the date of the assessment, and you add your score. The score is out of 110 points, one for every one of the 110 NIST 800-171 controls. It's out of 110, but it's not a straight scoring. There's actually, you lose points for every control you don't have in place, but some of them are weighted higher. Some of them are as high as 5 points if you don't have that one in there. Some of them are 3, depending on what you're after. So there's a whole process that you have to go through to actually score it. You want to make sure that you've got that from there. Let's see, a couple other questions that came up. Again, the cost, we'll talk about that. If we're bidding for an upcoming RFI, do we have until 2025 to be compliant? That depends on the contract, right? I mean, if it's, I'm guessing when you say upcoming, I'm thinking probably 2021. The question is when they put that RFI out there, will it have a requirement on it? Because not every contract in 2021 is going to have that on there. And that is just purely logistics. If you think about this whole thing, what the government has done is they've looked at it and said, look, we've got 221,000 companies out there that are going to need to be assessed. We cannot by any means be able to address all those 221,000 entities. So what they've done is they've created this accreditation board. The accreditation board is responsible for putting requirements together for auditing companies, these C3PAOs, and to basically anoint those C3PAOs as representatives of the DoD. We'll talk about that as we talk about auditing and that kind of stuff here in a little bit as well. It's those companies that are going to go out there and actually perform the audits. Well, even with the 100 or so companies that are going to, that have applied for it so far, they're still not going to be able to hit all 221,000. So there is a ramp up period. If your contract happens to be signed in 2021 and it has not designated a level, then the answer to your question is no, you wouldn't need it. But it could, and it might be a requirement starting in 2021. Maybe it ends up being in 2022, for the particular contract you're looking at. So you really do have to look at each of the RFIs, RFPs as they come out, look to see what maturity level it requires, if it requires one. But you can expect to start seeing those starting in 2021 for certain contracts, and certainly by 2025, all contracts will have that in there. Keep in mind, though, you still have to do this with SPRS and submit it up, submit your 800-171 up to there. Question was, how long does a certification last? It's 3 years. So every 3 years, yeah, you'll be required to go back through and become recertified. The reality of it is, I actually have a caveat to that at the end of the presentation, but yeah, 3 years on that. The reality of it is with the NIST interim rule, you have to maintain that throughout. So it's not like you're going to just do this, get it, and forget it, and then come back in 3 years. Yeah, so somebody made, Cynthia, you made an observation. Also, while it may start with DoD, it may, other agencies picked it up and copied the requirement. The answer to that is yes. And I will tell you, that is not something specific to just DoD. Guys, cybersecurity is a huge problem in our country, just in the world, really, in this country specifically, though, too. And what you're seeing is that doesn't matter if you doing stuff in DoD or other in industries and that kind of stuff. You are going to have more and more of these kind of requirements coming down from your customers, right? There's a whole industry around third-party risk management. And the reason for that is because what we have seen and experienced specifically over the last 4 or so years has been the fact that the majority of the times when somebody has information compromised, it's actually not at the covered entity, the main entity. on this. It's usually because of one of their third parties, right? So I'm going to go back to an observation. I think it was Cynthia at the very beginning had also mentioned, said, pointed out the fact that Microsoft and, I mean, if you look at some of these really large entities that have been compromised, yes, at the end of the day, they're the ones that are holding the purse strings, and it's their data that originally ended up in somebody else's hands. Most of those problems, though, didn't actually occur at the organization that is left holding the the purse strings. It's usually because they've shared that information with one of their providers, right? Maybe they sent information to a small, let's say it's a healthcare insurance company. They have companies that they hire to go and do analysis on their behalf to figure out what are the trends, what are things about this, what are the costs that we should be looking at. And one of those small entities gets compromised. Well, you know what? Where are the deep pockets? The deep pockets are back at the insurance company. And so as a result of that, all across the country, you are seeing in every industry, you are seeing companies push for these kind of requirements. Now, the good news is that every framework, whether it's NIST 800-171, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, CMMC, HIPAA, PCI, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, GDP, I mean, there's a whole host of them out there. There's a lot of overlap. 70 to 80% of the things that you should be putting in place for one of these is probably the same stuff that you have to have in place for another framework. And so eventually, it's going to be a long time, I think, but eventually we're going to be to a place where this is just commonplace. Everybody's going to have these controls in place because it's good business. It's the stuff we need to do to protect any of our information, whether it's your own intellectual property, whether it's your own, HIPAA information, PII, that kind of stuff. It's, you're going to need to be doing it. So Cynthia, that's a very good observation. You're going to see it a lot from there. What if you're just getting started in bidding and are becoming a new vendor? That's correct. You wouldn't have evaluated the system to 800-171. Very interesting dilemma on that one. We actually have kind of a strategy that we've recommended on that. And basically the gist on it is figure out what maturity level you should be at, and then get your get the CMMC for that particular that level on that one. Cynthia coming back again. Sorry, I'll go back to the question about where most of the questions criteria, 110 or 130, do not apply to you. Can you document a policy even where there is totally not applicable? We will not do X with the server, even though. Yeah. So the answer to that is that in a roundabout way, yeah. I mean, with your system security plan, that's what you're going to be doing is documenting how you're addressing it. And if you're addressing it because you are, 100% cloud-based or something along that lines, that's fine. You still have to though show that you've got the right things in place. And what you might need to do in a situation like that, where in fact, I'm working with a company right now where they're 100% virtual, but they rely upon other third parties. And what we've got there is you need to see where they're at, right? And so a lot of those organizations have what's called like a SOC 2 report, or in this case, they were in the healthcare industry, so they have high trust. There's things along that lines that we can get their document, which is, again, an outside company, kind of like a C3PAO, coming in and saying, yep, we've looked at their systems are in good condition. You can rely upon that in your organization. So there are some strategies from there. All right. I'm gonna continue because a lot of these, I do have slides and that kind of stuff on there. So one thing, since we're kind of on the topic of cost, right? I also want you to kind of think about the cost of the non-compliance on there. Under 800-171, it could be the cost of the termination of the contract. From there, whether it's directly with the DoD, to a prime if you're the subcontractor. From there, if you are the prime, then you've got to think about the fact that if you've got a subcontractor who's not compliant, that makes you non-compliant as well from there. So best interest from there. Obviously, breach of contract, lawsuits, that kind of stuff, the fines, that kind of stuff. And there is, a criminal aspects to this if it's willful, ignoring it. I can't think what the term is from that, but anyhow, some things there. So let's talk about the capability domains. So, because I want you to understand, and I'm going to breeze through these a little bit. I'm not going to go through every one of them, and I'm not going to give you examples for every one of them, but I am going to hit some of these just so you kind of get a flavor for what these domains are and what are the kinds of things that it's looking for. You can pull down the requirements. If you go out, and actually it's not there, the website isn't CMMC. I've got a slide at the very end that has the actual thing, but I'll wait until the end of the slide. But you can pull down the actual set of controls that you need. What you need to do is when you look at it, you need to understand how to read each of the control practice IDs. The first part of it, the R, like in this situation, RE refers to the capability domain. So it refers to this right here. So recovery, right? It's that's what domain this is in. This is the maturity level of this particular control. So if you are trying to go for a level 1, you don't have to worry about this control at all. If you are going for a level 3, a level 4, or a level 5, then yes, this control applies. And then this is just a unique ID, just a number. So that's the practice ID number. So with that in mind, here are some examples. And I went easiest to hardest, all right? So this is pulled directly from that spreadsheet that the DoD provides under CMMC, AC.2.011. It is telling me that it's access control. It's a level 2 control. So a level 1, you're not going to need to have this in place. 2, 3, 4, and 5, you will have to have it in place. And then it's just number 11. Authorized wireless access prior to allowing such connections. In essence, you don't have open Wi-Fi where anybody can just come in and access your system. How many of you have a password on your Wi-Fi today? Probably every one of you, all right? So you've already passed that control. IA 1.077. So this is under identity and authentication. Level 1. So everybody's going to have to go into this. Authenticate identities of users, processes, or devices as a prerequisite to allowing access to organizations' information systems. In essence, and this is where I get to this whole idea of understanding what these control objectives are. When you read the words, you guys might be scratching your head like, well, okay, what does that even mean, right? Do you use a user ID, like your first name and first initial, last name, or whatever? Do you have a username? That's all this is there. Again, if you do that in your system, which I'm guessing you probably do, 99.9% of companies out there do this, you already have this control in place. Again, it's commonsensical. You have to have a username, need to have a password to get into the system. Now, there are some companies that have the computer always logged in and they don't do it. That would be a no-no. But at a level 1, you would have to have that in place. Physical security, number 1, a level 1, maintain audit logs of physical access. Okay? Now, ideally, this is in regards to access to the environment where FCI or CUI is stored, but it's just maintaining audit logs of physical access. If you have a visitor registration logbook at your front desk as people come in, you have now successfully put this control in place. All right. So again, you can see those are the kind of controls you need to have in place from an easy side of things. Moving up the scale a little bit, now we're looking at things that would be at that level 3, the first level where CUI is introduced. So under access controls, level 3, number 14, employ cryptographic mechanisms to protect the confidentiality of remote access sessions. What the heck does that mean, right? Well, here's what it means. You need to basically have the connection has to be encrypted, right? If you use a VPN, a virtual private network, congratulations, you have that control in place. 3, again, AM3, define procedures for the handling of CUI data. If you have a policy that designates data retention, classification, and handling of this, you've satisfied this. This is a document. You have a policy, you put it in place, people, you introduce it to people, let people know, they know where to refer to it, they know what has to happen. Basically, the thing here is what you're getting to is, where is CUI allowed to be in your organization? And and you're going to have to designate that, because part of what you want to try to do is minimize your exposure to all of these controls and where the CUI is. So if you don't want to have to manage USB devices and external thumb drives and mobile devices and all that kind of stuff, then don't allow CUI on those devices. Put a policy in place, define procedures for actually handling the CUI, and now you've got that control in place. Reviewing, updating logged events, right? It's not saying that you necessarily have, it doesn't put a time frame or anything like that. It just says, are you reviewing and updating logged events to make sure that in the event that there is a compromise, that the information is being stored and logged somewhere so that an investigation can happen on it from there. Here, this one's a great one. I love this one. Employ replay-resistant authentication mechanisms for network access to privileged and non-privileged accounts. Say what? Most people looking at that have no idea what that is, a replay-resistant authentication mechanism. If you are using Windows Server, congratulations. If you are using Kerberos authentication, which most people are, you have already employed replay-resistant authentication mechanisms and you didn't even know you did it. This is one of those examples of you don't know what you don't know, kind of understand what these things mean. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, people like me who've been in the industry, I can look at that, my 20 years experience, I look at that and I know exactly what that is and I know exactly what control to put in place, to meet that, and you may already have it in place. But for most people who are going through these things and looking at these requirements and that kind of stuff, it's going to make your head spin if you're not a technology guy, if you're not a cyber guy. I get it. I do. And it kind of sucks. I agree. But the reality of it is this is the kind of stuff that needs to be in place, whether it's for the DoD or for any kind of thing from a cybersecurity standpoint. These are good controls to have in place. Now we start getting into this hard stuff, the level 4s and level 5s. And again, if you think about what the goal of level 4s and level 5s are, is it's that next level, right? It's making sure that our adversaries who are always trying to get in here and then trying to, again, have what we call an advanced persistent threat, we're trying to eliminate these things. This is the kind of stuff where when people think about hacking in, these are the kind of controls that will help to that. So here in this situation under AU 4053, we are automating the analysis of audit logs. Not just looking at it periodically. This one, CM 4227, we're periodically performing red teaming. Red teaming means hiring somebody to actually come in and try to break into our system, right? Pen testing, penetration testing, falls under that. IR 5108, establish and maintain a cyber incident response team that can investigate an issue within 24 hours. Again, I don't know about you, but if you don't have a dedicated IT department, you don't have a dedicated cyber, you don't probably have a dedicated incident response team. Now, can you hire that out? Yes, you can do that. Will you need to have it? Well, good news is only if you're at a level 5 from there. So with that in mind, that's kind of an idea of what, that's it. So here's that link. If you want to go out and pull down the actual CMMC framework yourself, that link right there, acq.osd.mil there, you can pull it down. Here's a briefing on it. There's information on a PDF of it. And then if you scroll down, the very last one there is actually an Excel spreadsheet that you can actually pull down and see all the controls from there. All right, let's see. A couple of questions. Oh yeah, so Eric, thank you for answering that. Yep, the location code in SPURS is the cage code from there. Okay, good. So no questions there. All right, so let's understand the whole process of a C3PAO, right? And to do that, I want to kind of give you an introduction to auditing, right? From there, not too deep, but just enough so you understand where they're coming from. If you think about it, any audit, the whole goal of the audit is to understand the controls that an organization has put in place, the practices, the policies, and the procedures that they follow well enough for that auditor to basically come to an opinion as to whether the framework has been adopted and is in place. And to assure whoever that external stakeholder is that that is the case, right? So again, think about that is that an auditor is going to come into your environment and they're going to want to do enough testing, enough things about it so that they can turn to, in this case, the DoD through the accreditation board and say, yep, this company is complying. They've got all of the stuff in place, all right? That's it. That's the goal of an audit. The goal of an auditor is to make sure, and in an auditing firm, whether it's a firm or just an individual auditor, the goal of that auditor is to make sure that they are not putting themselves at risk by coming to an opinion that is not defensible, right? So as I said, it's putting him herself or herself in an indefensible position when providing that opinion from there. Right. So in practical terms, what does that mean? It means that when the auditor comes in, they're going to need to tick and tie every single control to make sure that, yes, in fact, it's in place. And in order to do that, they need to collect some kind of proof that that's happening, right? So what does that look like? A lot of times it looks like testing it. You say you do this. So we go through an interview. How are you addressing this? You put your system security plan in place. I can read this. Okay, great. I see that's what you say you're doing. Do you have a policy that accompanies that? Yes, great. You give me the policy. I look through the policy. Okay, on its face value, the policy looks good. Great. Now, how do I know that you are actually doing it? Well, the way that we do that is through evidence. And basically, from an auditor standpoint, our statement is, if there isn't evidence that something happened, it didn't happen, right? So that's really critical as we start thinking about how we want to go through and prepare for CMMC or any kind of thing. I will tell you, I've been involved in a number of organizations that perform audits. This is kind of our mantra as well on it, is that the guidance that we provide to our auditors is that I want them to collect and document enough about each control such that somebody completely independent, somebody who doesn't have the opportunity to come in and actually evaluate the organization itself, doesn't have the ability to go in and do its own testing, doesn't have the ability to go and actually collect evidence on their behalf, that our auditor collects all that information, documents it in such a way that a person under those restrictions could look at it, read the information, see what that auditor has presented, and come to the same conclusion as the auditor that performed the initial audit from there, right? So again, it's all about collecting the evidence on that, right? Again, something that we want to talk about and think about as we are preparing for this. When at the time of having, a C3PAO come in here, you would expect that there's going to be some kind of pre-engagement planning, basically to understand the environment, to understand the scope, to understand the contract or the kinds of contracts that you generally bid on, to understand what level we're talking about. Right? So there's going to be that pre-engagement planning. There may even be that they'll send you some stuff up front. We usually do. We send something called the Prepared by Client list, a PBC, whereby people can start collecting stuff, policies, procedures, things that we don't have to actually set our eyes on at your facility, we can, look at there. So field work is where we actually, come on board, whether it's remotely or, they're the kinds of things that generally get conducted under field work, interviews, walkthroughs, actually testing the environment, looking on the systems, running some tests, that kind of stuff from there. Generally, you would expect that there's going to be some kind of closing meeting where at the tail end of that, you're going to get information about what they found, so that you can kind of hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. That you can ask questions in terms of, well, what does this mean, or how did you come to that conclusion? We've got this thing in place. It's also a great time to start talking about what you might have in place in terms of compensating controls, because there may be things that are manual. That when you just test it from a system standpoint, you may fail, but when you look at the whole thing, you might have some kind of manual compensating control for that. You're going to expect a report from the C3PAO. Probably is going to have some gaps in it, and there's a process for being able to remediate those. And then eventually that gets turned over. The report from the C3PAO gets turned over to the CMMC AB, the accreditation board, and you get your certification. And then, of course, there is a cost involved in doing that from there. So how do you actually become certified with under the CMM certification? So I kind of put it in these 4 phases, right? And the first part is getting the organization ready. I mentioned earlier, both in this previous section about evidence, collecting evidence, but I mentioned even earlier about that is that sometimes you might have to have controls in place for a little while to make sure that you've got the things in place. You're going to want to make sure that those things are put into practice. At some point in time, we're going to have to engage that certified third-party auditor, and then they submit it for accreditation. So we'll walk through those. So first thing, getting the organization ready. I highly strongly suggest defining the scope of the CUI environment. Now, in a lot of organizations, it is going to be the entire organization, because maybe it's a small enough organization that everybody touches CUI. Maybe you can narrow it down. So some things, like if you're a conglomerate and you've got multiple companies and only one, a couple of the companies focus on CUI information, then great. You can maybe narrow it down to that particular company or a division. You might, within your own organization, be able to compartmentalize it to a specific department. And if you can, what that means is those, again, I'll use level 3 as an example, the 133 controls with level 3, those 133 controls would apply only to that particular environment. So again, if we can narrow that down, now we can become compliant without necessarily having to enforce all 133 controls on the rest of the organization. Not that it would be a bad thing, because a lot of times, like I said, these controls are good from a cybersecurity standpoint in general, but recognize that you can do that. We can narrow the scope down on that. And that's definitely a good strategy certain times. Next thing you're going to want to do is determine what the required level is that you're going to need, right? What maturity level do you fall at? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? You can self-determine this, even without necessarily, obviously we're going to need to start seeing some of the contracts and that kind of stuff being put out there. The bids and RFIs and RFPs and that kind of stuff. Take a look at those. Take a look at the contracts, look at ones that are similar in nature to what you bid on and see where they're falling. Take a look at the kinds of information that you receive. If you receive CUI, you are automatically at least at level 3. I would then push and say, do you really, have really sensitive information? Is the contract really sizable? Is there a high risk? That kind of stuff. Chances are you're not going to be at a level 4 or level 5, but you are going to be at a level 3. If all you touch is FCI, the federal contract information, you're going to be at a level 1. And then, of course, the other thing is do you have COTS, right? And, commercial off-the-shelf services. If you do, then you're exempt. But otherwise, kind of self-determined. Talk with the contracting or procurement officers of contracts that you already have. We've employed this strategy with a number of clients. Call them up, ask them, where do they think you're going to be? They've probably already had some internal discussions about where this particular contract is going to land from there. So you want to determine that as well. Then go out there and get the most recent version of the framework, right? As of today, as of actually April of last year, 2019, the current version is 1.02 from there. I don't see it changing. There was very little change between 1 and 1.01 and 0.12. Couple of controls moved up or down in an assessment, in a level, but that was about it. Go get the framework. Do an honest assessment against that framework. Look at what your maturity level is and go through what it's asking for and do an honest assessment. Do I really have this in place? Do I have a policy that addresses it? Do we have a procedure in place? Are we collecting evidence? And if that's the case, then you're probably in a pretty good position. When I look at controls, what I look for is two things. One is the efficacy of that control, meaning that assuming that we are following through on this, is this a good control? Does it meet the objective that's been set up? Okay, let me give you a good example of this. This is a manufacturer that I dealt with, I don't know, probably 10, 12 years ago, something on this line. The control objective was you have physical security around your data center, right? Now, I knew what that meant. What it meant was that somebody can't come in and walk up to your server and immediately log in. They can't come in and stick a USB drive, a thumb drive into it that has a virus on it. That you can't have somebody just walk in and steal it, right? That was kind of the thing I understood, physical security was. Their answer to that control objective was, at all of the doors, we have metal detectors. Okay, now think about that. The objective was, do you have physical security around your data center? Their thought was, hey, we've got metal detectors. That was a poorly designed control, because even if they were doing that, which they were, they did actually have metal detectors at each of the doors, it didn't address the control objective. Somebody still could walk in with a USB drive with malware on it and insert that into this server. In fact, this company was one that they didn't even lock their console on their server. So somebody in the organization could walk up and log in to the server, right? So that's what I mean by about the design, the efficacy of the control. Is it well designed? You're going to find that out when you write your system security plan, right? Your SSP, because what you're trying to do is design a control around what the control objective is. The next piece that we evaluate is, are we executing on that, right? So if the answer to the physical security was, we have the data center located in the center of the building. It's on the second floor, meaning somebody can't just get in through a window. There's no windows to the outside. There's a locked door. The walls go deck to deck, meaning that it's not a drop ceiling that somebody could go up and over. There's access control that everybody has their own unique code and they put it in there. Okay, that's a great design. Now, are they actually executing on that? If we go and we test that, do we see that it's on the second floor in the middle of the building, no windows, door deck to deck with a cipher lock on it? Great. It does. It passes execution as well, meaning that they are doing what they say they're doing. And then the last piece, and this is why I kind of harped on this whole thing about the evidence, is that can we show evidence that that control is in place? Now that one is a really good example. It is a really easy example, I should say, right? You take a picture of it, you can see that, yes, in fact, that's it. The auditor can come in, they can test it. There's other ones where it's a little bit more subtle. So for example, one of the control objectives is that you perform a regular analysis or assessment against all the users of the system to know that the right people have access to the system, all right? So how do you do that? Well, one design might be that on a quarterly basis, you perform what's referred to as a user access review, meaning that you get a listing of all the employees, you get a listing of all the accounts that are on the system, you do a one-for-one match. We make sure that everybody has an account and every account that's on the system is accounted for in some fashion. They're either an employee, they're a subcontractor, they're somebody who's known, right? Great. So you've designed it. Are you executing on it? Maybe so. But if you're not keeping evidence that that review is happening, how is the C3PAO, when they come in to look at it, how are they going to know that you're actually doing that? And again, if you put that back in the frame of an auditor, they're not going to want to sign off and saying, oh yeah, it's apparent that you're doing this without evidence. So when you design the controls, when you design the response to this, be thinking about how can we prove this down the road? How can we show evidence that we're doing that? Maybe it's a simple email that goes back to the person who requested and said, hey, I'm finished with the user access review, and this is what I found. Or maybe it's in your ticketing system for your IT. Or maybe you're having an outside company like your outside IT perform this. It's a simple ticket in their system that says that they've performed the user access review this quarter. It's got a date and time on it. Boom, you're done. That's all you have to do. But I want you to think about, because of the fact that this is no longer self-certification, we can't just rest on the idea that we might, yeah, we do this. It's a practice, we do it. Nah, it needs to be that you actually have it in place and that we can show somebody that that's in place on that. Now, another thing I like to do is I like to design controls where it's a system control, right? That it just happens. It's ongoing. I don't need to even do anything with it. And in those cases, if we can do that, that's the best thing for us to do. So, and there's a lot of examples that you can do something like that from there. You're going to get a gap analysis, right? You're going to, after they come in, they're going to look at things. They're going to say, okay, you've got 133 controls here. These, 115 you're fine on. Here's the other ones there. And you should be doing this yourself, right? I mean, so I forgot, we're in that prepare site. So go ahead and do your self-assessment, right? Document what steps you're going to take based upon what you found. Assign an effort and a cost factor to each one, right? And prioritize them. The ones that don't require much effort, don't have a cost involved in them, get them done. Just prioritize those. They're easy to do, right? I will tell you, the good news is, in 20 years of doing this and in looking at very deeply, looking at the CMMC, the vast majority of things that need to be put in place do not require you to go out and invest in additional technology. There's going to be some exceptions. There's going to be some exceptions in each of your organizations because perhaps you're heavily reliant on technology and you don't have certain things in place. There may be other things where you're not reliant on technology at all, but you've ignored it for the last 15 years and you're in dire need of some things. Setting those things aside, if you're the run-of-the-mill company working, using technology to further yourself from an efficiency standpoint, my guess is most of what you'll have to remediate is putting in policies, documenting the procedures, tweaking some settings that already exist in there, and simply just addressing them. That's good news from there. So as you go through those, assign that effort and that cost and prioritize those first ones and just bang them out. Assign the remediation to somebody specifically, whether that's internal staff or somebody from the outside, your outside IT, another company, whatever. Make sure that the remediation is assigned so that somebody's responsible for getting it done and getting it done in a timely fashion from there. Complete that remediation, get it done, right? Make sure that any of those policies, practices, and procedures that you may have written a long time ago have been updated because you want to make sure that they're consistent. One of the worst things that you can do is have a policy in place that you're not following, or a procedure that states this is our standard operating procedure, and that's not what you're doing. It was a good idea, you pulled it down off the internet, you put the stuff in place, but you're really not doing it. That's where companies get into problems for this. So make sure you're documenting what you do from there. And then again, whatever you can do to collect that evidence, right? Create a system for doing it. Making it as easy to produce that evidence as you possibly can is something that you really want to do. Okay, so you've done the self-assessment, you've taken the gaps, you've looked at those. Now go back and just reassess those remediated items, right? So if you had 115 of them in place, based on your own self-assessment, you're going for a level 3, take the additional 18 ones and go back and reassess them. Right? Again, make sure that evidence is there. And from there. Then, at that point in time, think it's ready, go ahead and get that certified third-party auditing organization on board. That's the link right there to the CMMCAB.org is the accreditation board. You go to the marketplace, and the marketplace, that's where you'll find the different auditors. Now, I'm going to put a timeout on that for right now. Something I have not told you through the whole presentation, but you need to be aware of. Remember, they kicked the can down the road and said, January 2021, this is going into place. I will tell you, at least as of last week, I haven't checked it this week, but as of last week, the CMMCAB has not yet certified any C3PAO. There's about 100 of them that have applied, including ourselves, but they haven't been authorized yet, right there. I suspect it's going to be very soon, maybe still here in 2020, but more likely, I think, in the first quarter of 2021. What's the practical implication of that? Well, if you need to get certified in 2021 because you're bidding on a contract that requires it, and there are no, or the C3PAOs are just being announced, there's going to be a race to get there, right? So again, that's why I said earlier, you want to give yourself at least 6 months window on this, on there, because not only are you going to have the time to go through, do your own self-assessment, put the remediation in place, but you're also going to need to consider the fact that there may be, a run for getting C3PAOs in there from there. Some things to just consider when hiring one of the C3PAOs from there. Should follow that process I talked about before, the pre-audit planning, an opening meeting, the field work, on-site versus remote. There's nothing in the CMMC that requires it to be done on-site. I think a lot of that's just going to depend upon the risk tolerance of whatever C3PAO is, as to whether things can be done remotely or not. We could find out that through the accreditation process it is going to require it on site, but I don't see how that's going to be the case. Closing meeting, you're going to get the initial findings. Here's the good news: you do have 90 days from the time that the report is issued to close up any gaps, any deficiencies that you have. Here's something I didn't mention earlier. With the NIST 800-171, I did mention this part. With the NIST 800-171, you had the SSP, but you also had the remediation plan, the POM, right? The plan of action and milestones. There is no such thing as a POM in CMMC. It is required that all controls pass. So if you're at a level 3 and have 133 controls, it's expected that all 133 will pass. Now, they may not pass at the time that the C3PAO comes in, but you then get the gap analysis. You now have 90 days to get those remediated to the sufficiency and the level that the C3PAO is requiring on that one. So that is a little bit of a change as well. And it's, it's impacted right here by the fact that you do have to remediate those and get those gaps fixed from there. Once that's done, then you submit it to this, the actual C3PAO submits it to the CMMC AB, the accreditation board. The AB, their quality auditors review the assessment. Remember that comment I made about the fact that you need to collect enough information so that somebody that doesn't have the ability to go out and perform the audit can come to the same conclusion? That's where that comes into play. The quality auditors are going to look at it and say, yep, you've got all the information in place. The audit, the C3PAO collected all of it. They put it together in a nice little, format. the quality auditors look at it, they say you've passed, and they issue your maturity level certificate. As I mentioned earlier, the certification is good for 3 years, and it allows your organization to bid on DoD contracts up to the identified maturity level. So again, a level 3 would allow you to bid on 1, 2, and 3, but not a 4 and a 5 from there. All right, so I've got one last little section, then I'm going to open it up for questions and answer some of the ones that have came in during this time. Life after certification, it's right around the corner, right? So 3 years is going to come quickly. Originally, this slide was in there before the interim rule came out. And I just want to remind you that now with the interim rule, it's no longer just getting it in place. You have to have it in place and keep it going throughout the whole time, which just means that you're practicing the things that you've put in place, collecting the evidence, that kind of stuff. The one little caveat I want to put out there is there is a situation when you might need to get recertified before 3 years. And that is if you suffer a compromise, right? If you are breached, have a compromise, or an incident, a security incident that maybe hasn't risen to the level of a compromise yet, but could have, you have to notify the DoD. DoD comes in, looks at it. There is a possibility that they'll have you clean things up and say, you now need to go and get recertified because clearly there was some issue from there. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. It is 3 years from there. Now, let me just address some of the questions. We talked, a couple of questions came up about costs. The answer is, I don't think anybody knows specifically what the costs are going to be because when you look at it, there's definitely factors involved in this, right? So let's break it down into the 3 phases. The first phase is getting ready, right? So prior to hiring the certified third-party auditor, what are the things, what's the cost that you're going to have in terms of going through your self-assessment and making changes to it? I think there's an opportunity cost. I think there's an internal cost if you've got internal IT. It's going to take them away from other things that they may be working on. If you've got an outside IT company, it probably is going to be an expense for them to come in and take a look at it there. But I do think it's relatively on the lower side of things. I already said that the majority of the controls, and I think in the majority of situations, you're going to be at a place where it's mostly writing policies, procedures, documenting things, collecting the evidence, making tweaks. Are there going to be some of you out there that need to buy some equipment? Possibly. A new firewall because you haven't had a firewall that does some of the things that need to be done. You've got limitations on that. If you are heavily using mobile devices and you are accessing CUI on it, you might need to have what's called a mobile device management software, whether that's an internal or a cloud-based. That could be an expense. There's some other things along that lines. Most of which, though, if the environment is narrowed down the appropriate amount, if you put the right kind of controls in place, I think you're going to have very minimal expenses on that side. So then we get to the second, which is what about the actual having a certified third-party auditor come in place? I don't know. Don't know what to tell you on that one because they have not, again, the accreditation board hasn't anointed any of those yet. And we don't know what the guidance is going to be in terms of how long it's going to take those organizations to come in and actually perform the audit. I would assume, just throwing some things out there, that a level 1, it's a day process, half a day process. Honestly, can it be done remotely? I absolutely believe it can be. A level 3 for a small organization, I think you're probably looking at 2 days in the field, maybe 3, I would think. So if you kind of think about it from hourly rates and that kind of stuff, I think it's going to be commensurate with that from there. I'm not really worried about the 4s and 5s yet. If you're at a level 4 and a 5, it means that the contract is really big. It's really sensitive information. You're a prime. You're a high risk. You already know it, and chances are you already have most of the stuff in place. So I'm really focusing most of my thoughts and that kind of stuff around level 1 and level 3 for that particular reason. From there. it's again, until we learn who those certified third-party auditors are going to be, kind of what some of the pricing is going to be and that kind of stuff. I don't know what to tell you on that. If you're interested for a read, the interim rule, the DFARS 2019 D041, it's about a 30 or 40 page document. It does actually get into a lot of the costs and the thinking that the accreditation board had in terms of what they felt the effort should be and what some of the expenses and that kind of stuff are in there. Your mileage may vary based upon your organization, that kind of stuff, but there would be some things maybe from there. So let me turn to some of the questions that were already typed in here. Rob asked, is it possible to get a table of these controls with examples of technologies or policies that could satisfy them? Layman's examples too. I'm gonna have you reach out to me here in about a month on that. That's actually something that we're putting together. I haven't seen, I haven't seen anybody put something out that specific to CMMC. Having said that, if you look at that, if you go back to that one slide that has the thing to get the CMMC spreadsheet, if you pull that down, one of the things that you will notice is one of the columns has what we call as a crosswalk. It's other, I think they actually label it resources, but it is other frameworks where they pulled information from those frameworks. So for example, it may reference the NIST cybersecurity framework. It might reference Center for Internet Security, those controls. It might reference NIST 800-53, which is a different standard. It references some of those. There is a lot of information out there on those other frameworks. So if you, for example, if you saw something that it corresponded to AC.3 in the NIST cybersecurity framework, you could Google that and you'll find a lot of layman's terms on AC.3, for the NIST cybersecurity framework. So you can do it. It's some work. I'm not going to kid you. It's some work to get to there. But yeah, actually check back in about a month for us. And that is going to be something that we're actually trying to put together from there. Could have significant deficits in the certification audit remediate and then still, so I think I answered that one, Catherine, is that you do have, so the question was, if you had significant deficits in the certification audit, can you get still certified? The answer is by the end of those 90 days, you'd have to have those remediated. So the question becomes, how significant would those, would those be? It's 90 days, right? So I think in most situations, you'd be able to get those things remediated, on there. The question would be, is there any of those ones where you need to have it in place for any length of time? Those would be the ones you'd want to focus on right there. Cynthia thought about narrowing this as well. Could we limit any access to federal systems data to one PC, and the security for that one PC laptop would be the issue? So yes and no. So this goes back again to the concept that I said in terms of like narrowing the focus of or the definition of the CUI. The answer, to some degree is yes. The problem that you're going to run into a little bit is that some of the things are not just about that computer. They're processes, procedures, policies, things that go above and beyond that. So I'll give you a good example. One of the controls that you might run into could be that you perform background checks on individuals, right? Well, you could, if only, like, say 3 people are allowed to have CUI, could you label it or limit it to that? You could, but you might have to expand it to that as well. So that's just something you got to kind of think about as you go through that. But narrowing it down is definitely a strategy, because then you only have to apply those controls against that environment and from there. Keep in mind, with cloud-based ones, some of the things you get in run into on that is that you're going to want to collect their external audit reports, right? The SOC 2, the high trust certifications, those kind of things, and have those available. But you also want to read those and make sure that they apply. What do I mean by that? I had a client years and years ago when we were auditing. This was actually in the days of Sarbanes-Oxley, the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley. One of the controls was that they had adequate backups in place, right? And from a data recovery resiliency side of things. And this company looked at it and said, well, yeah, we rely upon the individual, we rely upon the company that we host all our data and that kind of stuff with. And I'm like, yep, that's fine. Let's get their SOC, at the time it was called the SAS 70. Let's get their SAS 70. I go and I open it up and I read it. And the very first thing it says is, disaster recovery and backup capabilities are excluded from this report. The auditor makes no representation about that, right? Well, that was a gap. That was a deficiency. Here, this company had been relying upon that, and yet the thing that they were going to get to do that, they couldn't rely upon. So my only comment on that one would be just make sure you take a quick look and make sure that it covers that from there. Let's see. Our activities to collect evidence chargeable under CMMC. I think when you mean that is an allowable expense. I mean, I suppose it probably could be, but again, I think you may want to be kind of careful about what is and isn't in there, and going into it with the idea that you're going to add those expenses in there, because it might end up being to a place where it's not keeping you competitive from there. Yeah, so this is a really interesting point here. So yeah, so James, you're looking at this and saying, look, we only need to be level 1, but we have the interim rule that requires us to submit our 800-171 self-assessment up to SPRS. Are there controls that are specific to that? There are. In those 17 controls, there are 17 of those, or I think probably all 17 of them are NIST 800-171 controls. So I'm going to give you a strategy. It's the last thing I'm going to leave you with. So do your self-assessment for your 800-171. Look at the 17 controls and focus and make sure that those 17 controls that you've got in place from there. As many of the other controls that you have, document them, put them in there. Submit your submit your score. You have your system security plan, which documents what you've done on those 17 controls. And let's say that maybe you've got another 40 of the controls in place. Great, document those. And then document a poem, a plan of action and milestones that address each of the other controls. But put the date out far enough that you're going to already have your CMMC certification, right? Because realistically, to comply with 800-171, it's those 3 parts. It's the attestation that you've got them with an SSP and a poem, right? The poem is the remediation plan. If you're working on those, you've done what is required under 800-171. So put it out 6 months, put it out 9 months, whatever, and then work to get the CMMC certification level 1 done. You're kind of done. So just a thought.
All right, thank you so much, Damon. With that, we hit 12 o'clock. So I think this was a wonderful webinar, a wealth of information. Thank you so much, Damon. We'll get your slides out along with the recording. And your contact information is there as well. So I'm sure if anyone has some questions, they can reach out to you, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And then, like I said, PTACs, we're following along just as well as you are. And I know there's some talk in the future of PTAC training specifically on CMMC so that we can, answer questions just as well. So thank you so much, Damon. Appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, this snowy, cold morning. Hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Great. Thank you.